You could save up to 50% of your water consumption. 20% of that is awareness. Before you start introducing the low flow fixtures, before you start recycling and treating water. So 20% is just awareness of, do I switch off the water tap while I brush my teeth? Simple as that.
Do you?
I do.
Excellent.
Tejarah Talks.
Welcome to the Tejarah Talks podcast that brings you conversations and discussions with innovative and inspirational members of Oman's business and investment community. My name is Adham Seyyid, founder of the firm for business and economic consulting. In this episode, we'll take a deep dive into Oman's net zero transition. Joining me today is Walter Simpson from CCED and Ammar Al Kharusi from OMRAN Group. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. Walter, why don't we start with you? Kindly introduce yourself.
Well, thank you very much. As you said, my name's Walter Simpson. I'm the managing director of CCED. We're an independent oil and gas producer here in Oman. Personally, I've been here coming up for 6 years, but I've been in the oil and gas industry for over 35 years. And I've seen some tremendous changes in our approach to carbon emissions over that period of time. And I'm really looking forward to the chance to discuss some of those changes and the implications they have.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Ammar, how about yourself?
Ammar Al Kharusi, Head of Development at OMRAN Group. I've joined OMRAN back in 2011, and I'm proud to say that we were the very first developers to really adopt a sustainability framework that I was part of setting it up, and we managed to develop the first green certified building in Oman, and we continue to strive to do so. Currently, we are overlooking a huge portfolio of developments that ranges from adventure tourism, just like the Musandam zip line, all the way to mega cities that we're developing across Oman, all with the unyielding perspective towards sustainable developments.
Over the past 10 years, Nodal has worked on some of Oman's most important digital transformation projects, including the Invest Easy portal and the Omani Census 2020. We've also been committed to developing local entrepreneurial talent through our Oman Talent Hub. With digital transformation playing a key role in Oman's Vision 2040, we're excited to see what's next for the country and how we can continue to be part of its journey.
So in November 2022, Oman has put out its official policy towards how it will achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, and it presented many of the challenges. Walter, why don't I start with yourself? In a global perspective, why is net zero such a concern today, and why is it one of the key policy targets that many countries have already put out there?
So, probably the biggest challenge facing us as a population worldwide at present. Global warming caused by CO2 emissions, effectively from us as a human population, is having an impact on the climate of the planet. And if we're to stem that impact, then we've got to reduce the amount of carbon that we pump into the atmosphere. And all the world's nations have got together, recognized that challenge, but actually solving it is not straightforward. It's going to be a huge challenge for all of us to be able to make that happen. And I look at it from the perspective of, we live in this developed world, those of us lucky enough to be in the developed countries, and what's driven that development has been increase in GDP. And that's brought all of the measures that we see for development, life expectancy, education, health, literacy, all of the real benefits you get from development have been driven by that increase in GDP. And there isn't a country in the world where GDP growth doesn't go with energy consumption growth. And our fuel for the past 100-odd years has been hydrocarbon based. So that development has gone with increased carbon emissions. And we are addicted to it.
Absolutely. And that addiction is becoming very problematic, I suppose. Ammar, coming to you, you've mentioned that you've been working very hard on sustainable practices. How's Oman approaching this net zero challenge, and what is the first stepping stone towards that?
The good news are we admitted that we are part of the problem. So that's great. And number two, just like Walter said, the entire globe is causing the issue. And if the entire globe really doesn't come back to solve it, then it's going to be a scattered effort. So that's great. It's good to see the humanity coming together to solve an issue. Oman, obviously, we are playing our part. But despite the fact that we are, in terms of population density or the economical activity, but if you take it in terms of per capita, we are actually quite on the orange or red zone. So we have identified the issue. And similarly, just like the entire globe is playing together, all the sectors in Oman have to play together. So we cannot really look at the energy sector and say that's where the problem is, go solve it, or look at the logistics and transportation, or look at the building industry, or the food production or the fisheries. All of us have to come together as various industries to really solve the issue. Today, definitely we have a policy, we have a plan. It's too early and premature to measure, but at least the intent is there and the policies are in place and they're turning from policies into legislation. But I'm sure that we all are wise enough to make sure that we introduce the change rather gradually than drastically, to make sure that we minimize impact to the livelihood of people and the quality of life. That started the issue to begin with.
And I like the idea that you've mentioned this journey needs to be well thought out and isn't one that needs to be rushed into. And I believe that's the national approach in Oman, sort of a balanced approach. However, and I'll ask this for both of you, are there any barriers that you see right now for Oman or a country like Oman to start this journey or continue on strongly in this journey? Walter?
I don't think there are any barriers to starting it, but it's the sheer scale of the challenge that taking that first step for everybody becomes, whoa, what am I going to do? This is such a big problem. So I think breaking it down into digestible chunks is probably the key piece to getting it moving. And I think there are a number of ways you can start to do that, from looking at the small savings that individuals can make to the easy savings that industries and companies themselves can make. And that's how you get started.
So, Ammar, what kind of steps can we take? Because, it sounds like it's doable to me. It's something that if you set it out and you've set out your KPIs and steps, that it is doable. Are we making it too easy? Is that?
It's never easy. It's a challenge, and we have to admit that. But just adding to what Walter said, you have people who would think that, why is this my problem? I'm just trying to make a living. So that's a barrier. That's a challenge. A lot of people just like, let me just go on with life. Let me just run my small business. Let me go to work. Let me do what I need to do. Why am I bothered with carbon neutrality and net zeros?
Why would I be bothered? How would I be bothered? Let's ask that question.
Exactly. And now that's when the awareness comes in. So if you start using the stick approach, probably it's going to work with some people, and different demographics, different mentality, different educational backgrounds, different interests in life, and I would say impact on the society. But if you really start with the awareness, with the incentives approach, then you could break that barrier, and you can turn it from policies to suggestions to rules, regulations to penalized actions. Then eventually over time we all gonna play and contribute to our part. And do not ever underestimate what individuals can contribute. So it's not only the big manufacturers or the big energy companies or big developers that really have to take an action. It's even you and I at our personal capacities at home. We can do a lot of responsible behavior that would contribute towards the overarching approach of carbon neutrality and net zero plan.
So is it a simple method of buying energy efficient appliances and fuel efficient cars? Are those the kind of practical steps we're looking at for industry to have automated systems, turn off the lights in the offices and better insulate your commercial buildings? Are those the kind of things that are going to make impact, do you believe, Walter?
They're a start. And unless we make a start, we're never going to solve the challenge. So I think they're hugely important. Some of them don't have a massive impact on emissions, but they start to get that message across about the importance of it. And so I think they're hugely valuable, even though they may not be great contributors. Symbolically, it's really important those things start to move.
Right. And I want to bring a point that Ammar had mentioned earlier about legislation and policies. And Walter, I'll start back with you again, and I want to hear more from Ammar as well. Are legislations the way to go, or harsher, sort of more stricter, with fines eventually coming in, or some sort of taxation, much to everyone's dislike? Are those the kind of things that we need in place to eventually get the process going?
It's quite a philosophical question in a sense. I think as a species, we like to follow the rules. And so I think a framework that you've got to follow is actually very important for us to be able to make that happen. And I think once that framework's in place, then fines for not following it do come as another incentive to make sure people are doing it. So I think it has a part to play, definitely. But I feel as though the scale of this problem and the impact it's having on the globe, it needs to be more than just legislation. There's got to be a cultural change in humanity that says, actually, this is important to us. Philosophically, people know it's important because they hear all about climate change and they see fires and storms and everything. But unless it actually hits them personally, it's always somebody else's problem. And we've got to get it to be individuals' problems so they really drive to make that difference.
And Ammar, you talked a little bit about development, and the OMRAN group obviously does a lot of real estate development. Mm-hmm. So many people say that building codes and other kind of legislation or policies would help us move towards that, or perhaps forcefully nudge us towards that. Does that resonate in sort of what you do on an everyday basis?
Definitely it does. So the building industry in Oman, in terms of building code, really the focus is not on sustainable developments. This focus is not on green buildings or circular economy. And whether it's developers like ourselves who will try to introduce some sort of sustainable development practices, but unless it becomes really a mandate. Once again, with a balance between taxation or legislation versus awareness and volunteering to adopt those practices is very something crucially that the government has to play. I mean, look at developed nations, if I may just diverge a bit. The European Union realized that too many restrictions have negatively impacted the economy, and now they're just fighting back. So they have done it, and let's look at them and say, okay, if the big manufacturers around the globe in the various industries have realized that these environmental product declaration and environmental regulations on internal combustion engines or transportations or food production have negatively impacted the economy and the growth prospect of those nations, let's look at that and see how can we do it better. There is no harm in that, and there is no shame in that. But going back, yeah, we definitely, about time we to introduce modern building standards, modular construction technologies, certain percentage of recyclable content. Let's, for God's sake, look into heating and ventilation in our buildings. It's about time not do it out of the back of the envelope calculation, but do it in an engineered and systematic manner.
But doesn't that present a challenge in itself? We're talking about 50 degree Celsius heats in temperature in the region. And we're asking us to be innovative. Isn't it much tougher to cool rather than heat sort of habitats? Or is that a misconception that the technologies are there today to help bring more efficiencies in the cooling? Because that is the biggest power consumption, say, in a country like Oman during the summer.
True. The HVAC system, which is heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, is combined together. So whether you're heating or cooling, it's the same energy consumption. In countries like -50, which I have never been to a -50. Thankfully, I wouldn't survive. They definitely do spend a lot in heating, and we do the same on cooling. But it's really not that difficult if you start introducing what is known as passive design elements. So before you start introducing active solutions, you think about orientating the building the right way, putting the bigger windows in the right elevation rather than the wrong one, which we do a lot in Oman. Using some sort of insulation material. It's not optional. It's mandatory to insulate your building to make sure that the heat is insulated and the cool air or the cool temperature is retained within. Designing your air conditioning system with the most efficient calculation, like ducted split units. Instead of having, 4 split units in a majlis, you can have 1, but with the right ducting. So that will reduce your cooling capacity and energy consumption eventually. And the list goes on. But it's just simple solutions.
Those are interesting solutions. But Walter, I want to bring you in on the awareness aspect here. Are we all aware of the mandate to start with? So you've mentioned about the philosophical, but people psychologically tend to be more worried about the negative effects, as you've said, when it hits them. But when it doesn't, is our awareness there yet?
Not to the level I think we need. I think that needs to be increased. And clearly starting with children is always a great place there. Get into schools, teach children about the impact of energy on their lives and how they can save it. And in no time at all, you'll have your 6-year-old telling you to turn the lights off if you're not in the room, or turn the AC off if you're going out. Happens very quickly with youngsters, and that's a great way to get
there.
This to move.
Mind you, my 6-year-old, or she's 7 now. We're still getting there. So, but that's what we often hear. Let's teach it at schools, and we know our curriculum has bite sizes of these. But ultimately, it's the action of switching that light off, that AC off, or the heating, or not driving when you don't need to drive, etc. So, Ammar, those behavioral changes, are you sensing them?
Yes, we are sensing them even in our adult occupants of buildings that have been designed to promote sustainable practices. So we are either encouraging by terms of awareness, or we're introducing automated systems. It's the same thing. Majority of the population is young in Oman. So I agree with Walter. If we start setting the foundation, excuse the pun, correctly, then eventually by the time they become the majority of the producing population in Oman, then yeah, everyone is aware and everyone is environmentally conscious to some certain degree or the other. Behavioral changes, I've given this example before. You could save up to 50% of your water consumption. 20% of that is awareness. Before you start introducing the low flow fixtures, before you start recycling and treating water. So 20% is just awareness of, do I switch off the water tap while I brush my teeth? Simple as that.
Do you?
I do.
Excellent. So I'd like us to talk a little bit about international benchmarks and how does Oman as net zero practices are compared to the rest of the world. So Ammar, why don't we talk a little bit about sustainable cities and how does Oman's efforts compare to the rest of the world?
So the Globe have identified that cities developments could be a potential target to really significantly reduce both embodied and operational emissions. It's the nature of the beast, if I may say. So there are good examples in Southeast Asia, specifically Singapore, that they are developing new cities with high development density, high population, but with the most thought after transportation system, circular economy practices, and needless to say, green building exercises. Similar things happening in Europe, in Barcelona to be specific. New developments are being also embedded and adapting some sort of a vernacular architectural city grain, but also adapting technology that will contribute towards reduction. Zooming into the region, there are great examples that are being developed, but I think in Oman, we have the perfect opportunity. We have a lot of undeveloped lands, and obviously the government, using the various entities spearheaded by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Planning, are planning for the future, which is great, with this mindset of how can we make our cities sustainable, smart, and how can we make our buildings green. We at OMRAN, we are developing in partnership with Diamond Developers the Sustainable City. And it is, I would say, at the peak of sustainable practices. Now, mind you, we have done green buildings before, and it's something that you can quote Ammar on. Every sustainable building is green, but not every green building is sustainable. Green buildings do not really, our certification system per se, do not pay attention to the socioeconomic impact. Yep, it's a byproduct. It's an indirect impact on the society and the economy, but the focus is on green building, which is great. But if you look at sustainability approach, and specifically in the city, because a building is different than a city, then we looked at the social, economical, and environmental impact. And even in environment, the first thing we started with is food. How can we self-sustain our food as much as possible? That will have reduction in emissions due to transportation, production, packaging. And number two, how can we give our, again, citizens of the city a sustainable practice in terms of cultivating their own produce, whether that's using biodomes like greenhouses or aquaponics and hydroponics. We looked at energy in terms of reducing demand by the passive design initiatives, as well as active design solutions, i.e. renewables. We looked at the water, reducing the consumption and recycling the used water. We looked at mobility, which is a big part. That's not necessarily low-efficient, fuel-efficient vehicles or electric cars. No, that's walking, that's cycling, that's an equestrian track. That's me designing the grain of the city to make sure that you could walk to school rather than drive. Or the corridors in between the residential villas are wide enough for electric golf carts. So you can walk, you can cycle, you can use electric golf carts rather than cars. And your car is parked and you use it in the city.
Interestingly that you mentioned that, because in some of our older towns in Oman, that the cities or the towns or the villages were designed as so.
Exactly.
There's a lot of shading during the day between houses and buildings, but with the capacity for small carts to move through.
And that was by design. So the vernacular architecture, our ancestors really designed the building in such a way that will promote, I would say, reduce the heat island effect and the solar gain. In the sustainable city as well, we looked at two aspects: the building material itself. So how can we promote a bigger percentage of recyclable content? How can we procure contractually all of our material from a certain radius, i.e. reducing emissions, and making sure that at the same time I empower the local businesses. So instead of importing overseas, I import from a company that's, again, within the society, that's a socioeconomic impact. And obviously, last but not least, is the waste, which apparently now is a resource. So how can we take the waste segregated at source, diverted from landfill, which all across each and every stages of those, you're contributing towards emission reduction. And how can we reuse that waste to produce energy, as in terms of a waste-to-energy plant, or reuse the material into our paving and landscaping.
That's brilliant, because that's very exciting developments. I think many of us will start to feel perhaps soon, as I'm sure construction is underway in
it is
infrastructure. But Walter, the word energy, Ammar has mentioned about 3 or 4 times, and that's really your business. And you've been doing it for more than 30 years. What kind of trends are you seeing internationally that are finding their way into Oman when we're talking about how the energy industry is aligning itself with net zero targets?
So I see the industry changing dramatically in terms of its understanding of and its the importance it puts on energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emissions. And I look at it as good business. I think, what is it that makes us as a business successful? Traditional measure, low-cost operator. That's been there forever. Yeah. But nowadays, you're putting on top of that a low-carbon footprint, and you're also putting on your value to the community that you work with. And so I look at it from the perspective, okay, how can I leverage that low environmental footprint and the value to the community in terms of helping me be a low-cost operator? How can we make that work effectively and get the synergies out of it? And I think that's where unlocking the potential of your people becomes hugely important. And I'll use an example from my own company where we put that challenge to our staff. So look, these are what we're trying to achieve. Where are there opportunities for us to improve in how we go about managing our waste streams? Mm-hmm. And they came up with the ideas. So we have grey water from our camps, and currently we ship that water in tankers to a municipal sewage plant in Duqm. So that's diesel consumption to get the sewage there, and we're using capacity in a municipal plant. They said, look, why don't we get mobile reed beds? That way we can put the grey water into a reed bed in our facilities, and from that we'll get fresh water out of there. With that, we can use our food waste, we can compost our food waste and get fertiliser. We can have fresh water, we can have fertiliser from our own waste streams, which allows us to green our camps and improve the environment that our staff are living in the field. Great idea, being put into practice. It's sustainable in the sense because it's come as ideas from the people themselves, and therefore they own it and they'll make sure it happens. So I think it's a great way of utilising waste streams to make you more efficient as a business and get some value from the community you're working with to make that work. And I think that is a way of multiplying this to make it work really effectively.
And there's an ultimate benefit from those reeds as well, as they would be absorbing some of the CO2 emissions.
Absolutely.
From the atmosphere. True. Whether in sufficient quantity or not, that's not the case. But as you've earlier said, every step matters. And
Absolutely.
Every little bit
every
matters.
Single step matters.
But the energy industry has also come under fire from practices, traditional practices such as flaring, gas flaring and whatnot. How has that changed as well, whether through international practices or international conventions?
So traditionally, when I started the industry, gas was seen as a waste stream. You got the oil. Oil's easily transportable. So if you find oil, you've always got a market for it. That was the way it worked. And gas was a waste stream that you needed to do something with. And quite often it was just flared. Now, over the last years, that has changed. And now gas is a valuable commodity. But it's always been driven as a commercial commodity. So you've been looking at, can I commercialize that gas and make money from it? And the LNG business grew out of that because that's the only way you can really transport gas over vast distances. The only way to other transport it is pipelines. So the use of gas has been limited either by access to LNG trains, hugely capital intensive, or by the ability to put in a pipeline to a local market for gas. And that's what's been driving the use of gas. Now, we've still got flaring industry, and we've got flaring where that gas production that comes with oil isn't commercial. And there's not a commercial solution to it. And so that's where people have had flares. Now, Oman has signed up to a zero routine operational flaring. And that presents a challenge to the industry, and we need to be more creative about how we use the non-commercial gas. From my perspective, for us, what we've said is, right, we will generate our own power from that gas. We don't have quantities that are worth export at the moment, but we do have gas with flaring. We'll use that to generate electricity, and that will replace the electricity that we currently generate by the use of diesel. Okay. So overall, our greenhouse gas emissions go down and our flaring goes down because we're now using that gas for internal power consumption. What we're starting to see on the technology side is uses for small quantities of gas, mobile uses that you can take to remote locations and start to be able to use that gas for, generally it's for power, but it can also be for treating water, it can be for data mining. There's a number of solutions that people are coming up with for small quantities of gas that's stranded because it's close to it's not very close to any facilities or any means to commercialize it. That's a huge change, and that's going to be instrumental in Oman meeting its zero flaring target, and actually in the world meeting its zero flaring target for 2030.
Yeah, that's exciting to hear that we're actually taking concrete steps. Now, gentlemen, we did talk a little bit, and you've mentioned at certain points that you deal with supply chains, and those supply chains play a very, very important role. And as you change how these supply chains behave, has big impact on the emissions, either the direct ones or the indirect ones. Ammar, what is being done today within those supply chains that is different to create more sustainable and less CO2 intensive supply chains, whether they're small businesses or large?
Great question. I remember the biggest challenge we faced back in 2012-13 when we were developing the first LEED certified building in Oman was the supply chain and the unawareness of the local supply chain about what is a energy efficient or star rated appliance is, or a VRF system, which is an effective air conditioning system is, or solar water heaters are difficult to come by, and obviously the misconception of these are going to cost you more because you're going green, so you're not sustainable. So we said, you know what? If we don't do it, then the misconception is not going to be resolved. So we really had these intensive awareness before we kind of floated the tender or the specifications to the market. Intensive awareness programs. It's like, guys, we are doing a green building. This requires specific steps. Design, products, and construction practices. So the main contractor was kind of, I would say, made aware of what kind of sustainable practices he needs to do to reduce his emissions and make sure he comply with the green building rating system. Now it's on a much bigger scale. The market is pretty much aware of what we're doing, and it's no longer Greek and Latin to them in terms of terminology. But we are still working with the suppliers to understand you need to submit, for example, an environmental product declaration form so I can calculate the carbon emissions and make sure I offset it correctly. And this is how you're going to do it. This is the form, and my people are up there to help you to make sure that you fill this form correctly. And yeah, I'm forcing you contractually to just procure from a certain radius from within the development. But guess what? I'm incentivizing you one way or the other to make sure that you offset the cost. And I'm asking for a certain product. By the way, this is a great example that's being produced in Europe. This is a business opportunity for you, Mr. Small and Medium Enterprise. How do you tie up with them? And I can guarantee you one thing, that I'm going to be off-taking your supply for a long, long time. And so the market started to realize that if this is the trend, and due to the sheer volume and the size of the developments that we do, it makes sense. It's not a single dwelling, it's not a single residential villa, it's a city and cities and major developments that we're doing as OMRAN Group that will adopt these practices. And people are just saying, you know what, that's guaranteed business. So let me go and grab my opportunity before it's an opportunity cost.
I like the idea, the word opportunity, because that makes a lot of commercial sense. Walter, SMEs are beginning to make inroads into providing solutions to many of our challenges. And there's a homegrown entity in Oman, 44.01, that works on carbon capture and sequestering and has made good inroads and had gained good reputation overseas as well. How are you managing those relationships, or are you looking out for these kind of sort of innovative entities to provide solutions in your industry?
We have to keep an eye on the innovative solutions that are coming along, because clearly they may well be the answer to some of the challenges we face as an industry. So definitely keeping a watching brief on what the likes of these innovative companies are doing. But I think there's more of an opportunity, particularly for Oman, around the Scope 3 supply chain emissions, around the regulations in buildings. It seems to me that we've got a tremendous opportunity to reduce those carbon emissions from shipping equipment, service into the country and developing them here. The amount of technology that you can start putting into buildings to improve their efficiency is right up the street of SMEs to get after and work on. And if we can develop local industry to provide the services we need in the oil and gas sector, in the building sector, and bring the manufacture of those goods to this country, that's a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous saving in greenhouse gases. So I think that kind of driver has got to be part of the solution and could be tremendously powerful.
I like that you're bringing your supply chains closer. As we've seen post-pandemic, many countries are already doing that, and many manufacturers. But there's a good cause behind this, isn't it? Really just holding back a little bit. Perhaps in a way of wrapping up some of these different strands and tying them together, we haven't spoken enough about renewable energies and alternative energy sources, ones that may compete with your current business model or provide opportunities. So we're talking about solar, wind, tidal. We don't talk enough about geothermal, and green hydrogen could not be obviously excluded from this conversation. Walter, what is your take on those kind of solutions? Are they, again, the silver bullet, as some might call them, or at least perceive them? Or we need to be a bit more pragmatic about our energy mix moving forward and how well it sits with net zero transitions?
So I don't think there is a silver bullet for this. I think we've got to have a balanced energy mix. And I believe that wind, that solar, that hydrogen, that wave power, that geothermal all have a part to play in that being successful. But they all have to have a part to play. I do see hydrocarbons having far less of a share of the energy mix, and I think that's going to be hugely important. But personally, I don't see them disappearing altogether. And I think that's what we need to be conscious of. It's got to be the right balance. We have to develop each of these technologies, but each of them comes with their own challenge, whether it's economics, whether it's transportation, whether it's you're in the right geographical location for it. They all come with some kind of challenge, so that mix is what matters.
Absolutely. Sustainable cities also means sustainable energies.
True.
And the power mix that we're talking about means that intermittency of renewables is a challenge. How are developments like Seyyid going to manage that process, keeping in mind it wants to keep its emissions as low as possible, if not zero?
First and foremost, I couldn't agree more with Walter. Excuse the pun, it's not switching off a light. So we cannot switch from conventional to renewable and expect everything to be okay. GDPs of countries rely on the production of energy the way it is. So we have to be really careful in managing that process and transition carefully. Number two is sustainability. If you look at the textbook definition, right? It's meeting the needs of our generation without impacting future generation. does not talk about energy, renewable resources. It's just meeting the needs. And the need is the quality of life. The need is the happiness. The need of providing me with what's really needed for me to thrive as a human, as a citizen. You don't want the power to be cutting off every now and then because you're just relying on a single source. So we are producing a big percentage of our energy using renewables, but we're still tapping into the grid. The renewables help us with two things. Number one, something that we haven't talked about yet, is carbon offsetting, carbon credits. So for every megawatt that's being produced conventionally, there is a certain percentage of ton of CO2 emissions, which is the ratio is 0.7. So how can I offset those 0.7 ton CO2 emissions by producing megawatts of renewables? Is I have done my part. So that's number one. So we're offsetting our carbon emissions, embodied and operational, using our own photovoltaic system and waste energy plan. But that's not enough. So what we are doing, we are expanding our scope. We're going into the vicinity and addressing first and foremost governmental institutions, i.e. schools and hospitals, and introducing clean and renewable energy scheme that will be installed by the developer over the coming 25 years, meaning that over time, we will be doing two things. We are meeting the Sustainable Development Goals of United Nations of clean and affordable energy and providing, I would say, educational institute that is functional to the masses. And number two, we are offsetting our carbon emissions, that no matter what we have done, they're still there, right? We've managed to reduce the emissions per square meter of built-up area using all the solutions I spoke about. But that's not enough. We are still emitting a lot. Sure. So in order for us to offset it, we really have to go beyond the scope of what our cities is. And that's the beauty of carbon credit and carbon offsetting. And that happens a lot in the manufacturing industry, where, once again, in the European Union and North America, a lot of manufacturers are mandated to have a certain percentage of their fleet as electric cars or a certain percentage of their products as net zero. So they go and buy the credit of another manufacturer, meaning that they're playing their part without impacting their own business model, I would say. So that's what we're doing and beyond.
Gentlemen, wouldn't you see there's a challenge, and Walter, I'll start with you on this one, I'll pick your mind as well.
Sure.
Ammar, that there's a bit of greenwashing again happening here with these buying these credits. So you take your part as part of the solution, but where it's harder to abate, more difficult, you're finding the easier solution rather than innovating.
That's certainly a valid perspective, I think. I suspect you speak to the companies about it and they say we're doing both. We're making sure we're mitigating that CO2 emissions now, and we're working on innovative solutions, but they're not ready for us yet. And I think that's the key to it really is, yes, look about offsetting them at present, but definitely drive that technology to see if we can eliminate them altogether.
Right. Ammar, what's your thought on the greenwashing?
It's the sheer amount of emissions that we cannot just simply wait for time us for to innovate enough without impacting, once again, the business case and viability of an organization or an entity. That's where the carbon credits are introduced. But everyone is doing it because one man's loss is another man's gain. So I'm, let's say, a very unsustainable practice, and without me doing what I do best, then I'm out of business, right? And all the families and all the employees are going to be impacted. So guess what? That's my challenge. Someone else could start planting trees, and me sponsoring the plantation of those trees, offsetting my carbon credit, producing, enhancing agricultural production, and at the same time offsetting carbon credits. One man loss, another man gain. And just like we said in the beginning, collectively we make an impact. Individually, it might be minute.
All right, that's a lovely argument, but the cynic in me always would think, is it enough to offset using carbon credits? But that's an argument for another podcast, I believe. Gentlemen, we've had a very quick journey through Oman's commitments to net zero 2050, and you've given us some very interesting insights into what your industries are doing today in Oman, but also how well they're aligned with international sort of direction and standards. Any last thoughts, Ammar, on this journey to net zero for Oman and for the world as well?
I looked at the number of emissions as annually as a globe. It's 52 gigatons. I don't even know how many zeros is that.
One too many.
And as I said, Oman admitting and really committing to be part of the solution is a great first step. There is a lot to be done, both from a soft awareness perspective and updating all of our standards and legislation. But I'm truly confident that with everything we have seen around, when all the, I would say, the thinking heads come together, we are on the right track. We can make an impact, whether as individuals, as entities, as different sectors. And as long as we just, filter out the noise, make sure that we drive with this unyielding perspective that we are going to do it, we will do it, inshallah. I don't know about you, Walter.
Oh, so I'm with you on this one. I look at Oman specifically, and I look at a country that only exists as it is today on the back of hydrocarbons and a tremendous foresight from the leadership about a vision for the country. And then I look at a commitment today to change that and look at net zero and look at a change in the way the country operates and the way it delivers its energy. And I think that's a tremendous step forward. And I think we have the brains and we have the capability, if we can harness it, to make tremendous steps on that journey.
Excellent. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us on the podcast today. It's been a very insightful journey. I wish you all the best.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much indeed.
If you've enjoyed this Tejarah Talks podcast, share it with your network. Until next time, stay curious.
Tejarah Talks.